Waking Up White by Debbie Irving is all about the author's story of exploring race throughout her life and waking up to her privilege of growing up in suburban white America. We read about her journey of struggle after struggle, as well as breakthrough after breakthrough. She describes her discovery of redlining and the discrimination with her father's benefits from the GI Bill, as well as systematic racism. Things like discrimination in banking, schools, geographical areas, job recruitments, and so much more. Throughout her story of racist discoveries, we as readers learn as well. We learn about privilege within our own lives and are prompted with thoughtful questions to push our thinking even further. So, I actually purchased this book long before this course. I purchased it right when I was offered my very first teaching position in North St. Louis, which is a primarily low income Black student body. I knew that accepting this position would put me in a place that I was really unfamiliar with and probably pretty uncomfortable with. So, how was I going to go through and grow through that uncomfortable feeling? So, I ordered all kinds of books. I ordered books that would inform me and help me relate to my students' culture. This was one of them, but it just wasn't on the top of my reading list because I had such awesome books, so I never got around to reading it. I'm really sorry that I didn't read it until now because this book has truly opened my eyes to my side of racism and the view from that side. Um, the author of this book comes from a place like me, and so I can relate to her very well. She looks like me and even thinks like me in a lot of her stories. So, that being said, I could easily utilize her stories and information in my own culturally responsive pedagogy. She pushed my thinking as to how I respond to the cultural experiences that I have every day in my life and how I respond to those with my students. She also pushed my thinking as to how I reflect and view my own culture, that is, American culture. I grew up here. And throughout this course, I have been pushed to think about what my culture is. But having Debbie Irving kind of describe her story and her culture and question my own really helped me to get to a point where I can reflect upon my culture deeply. So, where am I going from here? Where does this book take me? First off, I really want to mention how just reading this book in my classroom during my plan time, during our academic lab, which is like a study hall, has already sparked so many conversations between me and my students. Because the title of this book is so blunt. My book would just be sitting on my desk and it says Waking Up White. And so my students would see it and they would be like, Miss Byington, what are you reading? And they would just automatically question it naturally. I mean, you know, they're high schoolers. They just say what they're thinking, and so they question what I'm reading, which is actually great because it would prompt conversation and allow me a chance to educate my students on things they might not know, like redlining and the GI Bill, which are things that Debbie Irving talks about a lot in her book. But I also tell my students about the author's journey and how how the title of the book is Waking Up America, and how she was waking up to racism and how she was truly asleep for most of her life to systematic racism in America. So these conversations with my students have actually sparked something inside of me as a teacher, and I feel really empowered when I'm talking to them about these topics. You know, you become a teacher because you want to influence students' lives for the better, but how do you do that, and how do you get to a level of thinking like these big ideas, these big world questions, when as teachers we are supposed to be hitting certain curriculum standards and pretty much teaching for testing. So I'm kind of lucky because as an art teacher, I do get the opportunity to have conversations like this with my students. It doesn't always happen because My students come up with their conceptual artwork on their own. I prompt them with big ideas and big questions, and they come up with it on their own. And sometimes I will have students who come up with topics like these. And to be honest, in the past, I've always kind of been like, oh, that's really great. I'm so glad you're thinking like that. But I never sit down and have a conversation or take that opportunity to have a class conversation. I now realize that these are the types of conversations I need to be having with my students, no matter how uncomfortable. And I am in this unique position as an art teacher, as a high school art teacher, to just be able to segue into those conversations easily. And I need to jump on those opportunities more often than I do. They also need to know factual information. And as long as I'm educated on the facts and can present them with this factual information, then they can reflect upon the world around them. As artists, that's what we do. We respond to the world around us. That's just good art. There is a stark difference between Sonia Nieto's writing, her tone, and the light in her eyes, as compared to Debbie Irving's Waking Up White. They speak of different cultures and address different topics of racism. Although they both share their own stories and experiences with racism, they are sitting on opposite sides of the story. However, I have to say, having read Nieto's book first, and feeling kind of pointed at for being a white female teacher, and then juxtaposing that with Debbie Irving's writing, and being able to understand her experiences and relate to her experiences, and then looking back to Nieto and being like, okay, yeah, I get it. I understand where you're coming from. These two books complemented each other well for me. While I was reading Irving's book, I continually thought back to Melissa Crumb's TED Talk of A Tale of Two Teachers, and how growing up as a Black female, she had two different experiences with her teachers. One of her teachers was very kind and understanding, and Melissa felt that she could relate to her, and the other one was blind to racism. It's interesting because Irving is actually both of these teachers at some point in her life. We hear about her stories of how she treated her Black and Mexican friends when she was younger, and at that point, she was just blind to racism, or as she calls it, asleep. And then she becomes more like Crumb's first teacher, who is caring and understanding, and she's knowledgeable on the topics of racism, and she has more empathy. Not that the second teacher wasn't those things. She's just asleep. She was uneducated on current racism in America. Unfortunately, that happens a lot. She was yet to wake up and see her white privilege. So moving forward and looking to the future, after having read both Debbie Irving's book and Herbert Cole's I Won't Learn From You, I feel that I can not only pinpoint when a student is choosing not to learn from me, as illustrated in Cole's article, but I can also kind of understand why that's happening after reading Debbie Irving's stories and explanations of racism that she's experienced. These two paired together make a nice concoction for understanding how to approach students who seem to be disruptive on the outside, but when in reality, they just are choosing not to learn from you for cultural reasons. So Irving even runs into this in one of her stories when she organizes an event. It's a weekend event, like a festival, and the goal of this event is to bring in families, like inner city families that tend to be mostly all Black. And so they're bringing in these Black families into their very fancy, very ritzy white neighborhoods. And she mentions this in the book, but we think about how these Black families felt as they came to these neighborhoods and surrounded by all white people. So I have to think of that story and relate it to teaching, and think about those families that came into a completely different area that they were unfamiliar with. That has to be uncomfortable, and I can relate to that going and teaching in North St. Louis, and I felt so uncomfortable. So how do my students feel coming? I have two students who are only Spanish speaking, and they just moved here about a year ago, maybe not even that long, and I have to think about how they feel coming to a place that they're completely unfamiliar with, and the culture they're unfamiliar with, and they don't necessarily look like everybody else, and so they're uncomfortable in this environment, and they may choose not to learn from me. having read and understanding this not learning, I feel that I can approach it in different ways the next time that it happens. Reading Debbie Irving's story has really challenged me to think back upon my life and recognize times when I got something because of white privilege and times when I inadvertently expressed racism. It was helpful to read along with Debbie and relate her story to mine. She's not pointing the finger because she's righteous. She's sharing how she herself was culturally unaware and blind or asleep to systematic racism in America. I relate to her in many different ways, and that challenged my personal identity because she challenges her personal identity. She reflects on how she could have handled situations differently, and I too have had familiar situations. So that forces me to reflect on how I could have and should have handled certain situations differently. While I have been raised and educated to be much more awake to racism than she was at my age, it's still not enough. I need to be doing more. Which brings me to how this book has challenged my teacher identity. I have a powerful position being a teacher, an influencer, a molder of lives. Look how one small experience with Melissa Crumb's teacher affected her and impacted her life forever. As I mentioned before, this book has sparked conversation within my class already. But not only that, it has helped me to remain consciously aware of my interactions with my students who come from a different culture than my own. I never want to accidentally leave a mark on a child's life forever like Crumb's asleep teacher did. I want to leave marks on students that affect them because I am awake, and this book has helped me to open my eyes even